Welcome to Mind of a Scientist. It is my great honor to welcome Balm Krueger, aspiring winemaker and cider maker. Thank you, Balm, for being with us today.
Want to give a little disclaimer, just like some of the other scientists here. I am not quite up to the PhD caliber of some of your previous scientists here, but I do have a couple of science degrees from Santa Rosa Junior College, and I have been in the wine industry for around a decade now. So what does it mean for me to be in the wine industry? I've been living here in Sonoma County since 2007 after I graduated from University of California, Santa Cruz. And when I was at Santa Cruz, I actually was not really thinking about science and any of that type of stuff. I started off with a degree in psychology and sociology. So thinking about being an engineer or doing hard science essentially wasn't in my thought process. But I ended up moving up to Sonoma County and immediately becoming interested in what was going on with all of these vineyards and all of this agriculture around us. And I had turned 22 after graduating and was able to start tasting wine and then kind of start tasting more wine and more wine. And so after having this as a hobby of mine for quite a while, I started taking classes at Santa Rosa Junior College, thinking that I wanted to do all the prerequisites to go to Davis for their master's degree program in winemaking. So essentially, I guess what I'm saying is whatever you choose for your first path in college isn't necessarily how things will end up being either, because I had no idea that I would be taking organic chemistry and calculus classes when I was a senior in college. And then all of a sudden, 6-7 years later, I'm taking these classes with kids 6-7 years younger than me, and we're all kind of on new paths in our lives. So let's see. Begin with the big picture and the meaning of my work. I guess the meaning of my work now is I just want to enjoy life and contribute something that I appreciate doing and that I feel brings other people joy. So as well as brings myself joy. Because if I gave any advice to any of you out there, it's follow your dreams and follow your passions, because that's the most important thing. It's definitely not about money. And I will tell you right now, if you want to get in the wine industry, it's not going to be about money. You're going to see that every other kid you took organic chemistry with that ends up working at a pharmaceutical company is going to just be making triple what you're making. So definitely don't think about the money, think about the passion and what brings you joy. So some of the difficulties I encountered. One is that it's been a long road to what I thought I was going to do and then what really did occur. I thought I was going to take 3 or 4 years and then go to Davis right out of Santa Rosa Junior College after doing all the prereqs. And here it is a decade later, and I still haven't gone to UC Davis. So just because you think you're going to do something, there's a lot of different ways to get there. And over the last decade, I've done a lot of different things that I'm really proud of, such as making 100 cases of my own wine a couple years ago, making more wine last year, making hundreds of gallons of cider last year, and still not going to Davis, but still having the option at some moment in time. But that hasn't disenabled me from actually becoming a winemaker, because you don't have to go to Davis to get a degree to be a winemaker. And it's a lot harder though than you think to start doing something from scratch without ever knowing how to do it until you actually start doing it. So some of the tips I have for finding success in school, definitely to follow your passion, but challenge yourself too. Like taking difficult classes is always a signal to any future employer, as well as to any college, that you're willing to put in the work. And one of the things that I learned the most was actually from an economics professor who really challenged everybody with the concept of time management and opportunity costs. And an opportunity cost is what you're choosing to do and what you're choosing not to do. It's essentially the value of giving up the next best thing that you could be doing. So it could be Saturday night and you could be studying for the calculus exam, or you could be hanging out at your friend's party. And that's not to say you can't do both, but there's always an opportunity cost with choosing to do one thing over another thing. So let's see. What does a typical day look like for me currently? So currently it's June, and if you're in the wine industry, depending on what it is that you're doing, there's not a lot going on in June. So it's almost like it's a very cyclical thing that we deal with for harvest. If you get into the wine industry or the agriculture industry or the cider industry or any of these industries, it's going to be the fall months are going to be the months where all of the magic happens, where you see all the photos of harvest and crush and winemaking. That's when things really happen and you're working 50, 60, 80, 100 hours a week. Whereas currently, right now, I'm just dealing with paperwork and basic stuff in the winery to make sure things run smoothly, such as topping barrels, adding sulfur to barrels, doing basic analysis, and kind of just going through the winery. What I love about my job, about just making wine, is there's something beautiful about putting in hard work, waking up early, smelling fermenting fruit, and just kind of being with all the other people that also share a passion. And I think that's one of the things that makes getting into the wine industry so amazing, is there's just such a passion between the individuals in the wine industry. And it really blends science and art and agriculture and history. And it's kind of so many things bring it together that really, once you're in it, and I know some of you are a little bit younger, but once you get a few years older, especially if you're here in Sonoma County, I'm sure you'll start experiencing a little bit of tasting wine and being out in the vineyard and enjoying good food. So definitely talk to your parents or your older siblings. And as far as books or films I'd recommend, it's like, I would actually recommend a book because I love chemistry so much, but it doesn't quite have to do with the wine industry. But I really enjoyed The Disappearing Spoon. And I'll hopefully look up who wrote that here, but it's one of those books I read in between chemistry classes that really got me excited about just learning more about chemistry. So I guess without too much further ado, I can kind of give a quick little presentation here on some of the things that I do in the wine industry, the viticulture industry. And viticulture, by the way, is the science and study of grapevines and the cultivation of grapevines. So there's definitely a connection between winemaking and viticulture, because without the farm and without the vineyard, you wouldn't have the physical product that then gets turned into grape juice, grape must, which then gets turned into wine. All right. So thanks again for having me on here. It's funny being considered a scientist a little bit to me, even though I have been an organic chemistry teacher's assistant. It still doesn't quite feel like I'm a true scientist. So my presentation here will be on winemaking and viticulture. Let's see. I started off, as I said earlier, just as a hobby, and really going out to different wineries, different vineyards, I went through Santa Rosa Junior College. I did their enology program, which is wine chemistry, and I did their viticulture program up at Schoen Farm, which I highly recommend. And then because I just love degrees and certifications, I ended up getting my qualified applicator's license through the state of California so that I could be in charge of pest management, and as well as so that I can order sulfur dioxide gas for wineries. Um, I've had quite a few internships at various wineries around Sonoma County, as well as being an operations manager at a vineyard management company. And I am currently starting up my own winery with my brother, as well as looking into starting up a cider business. And that is definitely a lot of work. So let's see, that's a picture of me. Just if you love the wine industry, you're gonna have fun. And here in Sonoma County, we have a lot of options. You could get a job in a laboratory. You could get a job in a cellar, which is, I'm currently in a cellar there. You can get a job in the vineyards or in the orchards or some combination. Here's a picture of my hand in a grape cluster out at Sunrise in Anderson Valley. And so you start off in the vineyard at harvest and you are picking grapes or clusters. Then you're going to essentially process all of these grape clusters that I have been pushing down fermentation as they started occurring. So let's see. Harvest. This is just from later in this day. This is actually from 2017 with a bunch of my coworkers from Costa Brown. After we harvest the grapes, we'll put them into large containers, and the grapes may have they'll have native yeast on the actual grapes. But if you don't want to use the native yeast, you'll choose a winemaker's yeast to start fermentation. And as you can see on tank number 59 here on the right, the fermentation has been so aggressive that you can actually see the pink foam bubbling over the top. And here's another example of the yeast we have here. Let's see. You'll make a little yeast concoction depending on what you're trying to ferment, what the goals are, whether you're looking for fruitiness or earthiness, or if you have a high alcohol wine, or if you'd like to have low H2S, which is kind of the egg rotten smells. So each yeast has a different characteristic. And as you can see on the left, all of that foam is the yeast essentially becoming active. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that these barrels have the bungs, which are those dark gray things on top of the barrel. All those bungs are slightly askew to let oxygen out, because during an active fermentation, meaning that the sugars are being converted into alcohol and carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide is pushing up any of the active, just any of the ingredients in that wine, and it's spewing out of the top of the barrel, essentially. So when I say sugars, I'm really talking about glucose. As you can see, the chemical compound here on the left-hand side is a glucose molecule. And during fermentation, the yeast are eating the glucose and they're processing it into 2 ethanol molecules and 2 carbon dioxide molecules. And so the ethanol is really what you commonly know as alcohol. And the carbon dioxide is just a gas, which then becomes expelled. So what does it mean to be a winemaker? like a winemaker at a winery, there a lot of times a winery can be 3 people or it can be 50 people. And if you have a large winery, then the winemaker, their biggest decision is when to pick the grapes. So the amount of sugar that is in a grape is going to impact the total amount of alcohol. So the higher the sugars, the higher the alcohols. Typically, wines in this area will be between 12 and 16% alcohol. And the higher the alcohol, usually the lower the acidity. And the lower the acidity, the longer the wine can actually age for. So these are kind of the most important decisions the winemaker is making, or among the most important decisions, which is what type of style of wine does the winery or winemaker want to have? Do they want to have a really ripe wine that has really high alcohol and maybe lower acidity? Or do they want to have a balanced wine? These are the big questions, and a lot of this just comes down to experience. My personal style is I'd like to have a little bit lower alcohol wine with higher acidity that can pair better with food and last a little bit longer. So what does like a typical workday look like? I've worked in the laboratory, I've worked in the cellar, and I've worked in the vineyard. But I know that since we're talking science here, what does like a typical workday look like in the lab? When I was working at Costa Brown, it would involve a lot of calibration, just calibrating and calibrating and calibrating. So we would set up a pH probe, which wine typically has a pH between around 3 and 4. But when you calibrate a pH probe, you're just calibrating it to a specific buffering solution so that then when you put in whatever your solution is, it can accurately read it. So I'd calibrate the pH probe. I would calibrate a Y15 enzymatic. I would calibrate the enzymatic machine we had. I would make solutions for our free sulfur, because testing the amount of sulfur in wine, in a finished wine, is extremely important, because sulfur is antioxidative, meaning that it essentially repels oxygen from damaging your wine, which is extremely important. And I would also calibrate the DMA, which is just a way to test your sugars. And every single day during fermentation, you want to be looking at how the sugars are dropping until there's no sugars left and there's only alcohol left. And so you want to test the sugars and the temperature just to get a gauge each day for how your wine is fermenting. As well as another important winemaking decision is, what are you adding to your wine? You're doing analysis immediately upon getting your grapes, and you're determining what you want to add. Do you want to add acid to lower the pH to get to your optimal pH? Some wineries will add tannins. Some wineries will add enzymes. Some wineries will add all sorts of things. Another typical thing you would do each day is you're going to sample barrels that have been from the previous year, because you want to keep on having a consistent regime where you have current analysis on every single barrel/lot of wine in the winery. And then also at this time, this is why harvest is so crazy, is you're doing analysis on the current wine that's happening, that's fermenting. You're doing analysis on the barrels from the wine the year before. And then you're also getting berry and cluster samples from vineyards and running analysis on those, so that the winemaking team can really know where the grape clusters are in the vineyards, so that they can make a decision on when to pick. So modern winemaking, it's kind of an art and a science. The winemaker, as I've said before, they need to understand how the chemistry impacts the end product. You want to know how high the sugars are in your grape clusters, because that will be turned into the alcohol. You want to know what the acids are like in the wine, because that's going to have effect on your pH. And a really contentious issue these days is the use of sulfur dioxide in wine. So there's a natural wine movement that is looking to use minimal or no sulfur dioxide. Myself, I believe that using moderate amounts of sulfur really is important in wine, because you do not want to have an oxidized wine. So earlier I was talking about some of the stuff in the winery. So because I know we're science oriented here. On the left is the enzymatic machine, which allows you to test malic acid, residual sugar, acetic acid, which is essentially the vinegar. And then with this same machine, you can test a wide array of other things such as nitrogen. And then on the right-hand side is the aeration oxidation for testing sulfur. So just because you're in the winery doesn't mean we don't get to not play with fun lab equipment too. So the enzymatic analyzer, definitely a pH probe, an alkalizer to test the alcohol levels, microscopes to look at various organisms that might be inside, such as you're looking for Brettanomyces or lactobacillus or other entities that may be negative. And then you also have a bunch of reagents to prepare all these various solutions, whether you are making something for tartaric acid so that you can find out the TA, which is the titratable acidity in your wine, or whether you are making any other reagents for any of these other wide array of things that may occur. But it's not all just about what's going on in the winery. I think this actually may be one of the most useful things for a wide array of people that are interested in something beyond just vineyards. This is one of the best things I learned from my soil science class at Santa Rosa JC. Was we were able to use these free resources, which never ever can you get enough of free resources, in my opinion. So here we can go to the Web Soil Survey. So here's the Web Soil Survey, which is one of the best free resources out there that I could have ever asked for. It's helped me in a wide array of things. Say you want to help your parents look at their property that they're thinking of purchasing. Say you're wonder what soil a vineyard has. Any of these things can be used. So you're going to click on the Start WSS, which is the Web Soil Survey. You can type in any address you want. You're going to find whatever it is, your area. You can kind of scroll in or out using these magnifying glasses and then clicking on them. So here you can see the Russian River right here, and this is West Side Road. So I'm just going to get in a little bit more. And to find your area of interest, you're going to come over here to this little polygon tool. And so I'm just going to do a crude one here, but you're going to click it wherever you want. I guess you can't see my finger, but you're going to click it and you're going to start dragging it around the perimeter of whatever it is that you're looking to define. So as I said, this will just be a really crude one, but this is just to show you that there's going to be quite a few different types of soils And then you're going to double click to create this soil map. And you can see the blue area right here is what I've created. It's 136 acres, so this is not small. I'm going to go up to soil map. And here now I have all the different soils that are being shown. So in this 136 acres, you have all these different symbols down here. You have RNA, which looks like river wash, which makes sense because we're by the river. We have ADA, which is alluvial land and sandy. And so it's going to tell you out of this 136 acres, you have 18.4 acres of that, which is a little bit over 13%. You're going to have RNA over here, more river wash. This makes sense. You're going to have YMB. So you're going to have your YOLO sandy loam, overwash, and then it'll also tell you the percent slope. So this is 0 to 5%. So this is really flat. Whereas if you see below it the YVF up here at the top, that's 30 to 50% slopes. So it's just a totally, if you're thinking topographically, this will be helpful. So I just wanted to kind of show you how that can work. Then you're going to go up here to printable version. You can name this something. So I'm going to name this Rocchioli Vineyard. Then you'll be able to view it, and it's going to create this little template for you. So now all of a sudden you have something that's easy to print out. You're going to have like West Side Road here, Sweetwater Springs Road. You're going to have a direction as well as a scalability. And you always are going to need to have a scale on any map. That's just something you always need. It's going to have a legend with all of your information here. And then you'll also have, once again, your unit symbols kind of being displayed for you so that you have an idea of what it is that you're working with. So let's see. So here's where we were. We were right here on this web soil survey. And I wanted to do that because here's Rocchioli's blocks. And you can see where they've planted Pinot Noir. You can see where they've planted Chardonnay, where they've planted Sauv Blanc, and then where they've planted their Pinot again. So this Pinot down here is actually called River Block. And then the Pinot up here in Sweetwater Vineyard is called Sweetwater. And these two vineyards have completely different tasting wines. And it's kind of one of the things that happens when you get into the wine industry is you realize there can be such a huge difference, even when something is just down here by the river versus up here on the hill, even though they're just a few thousand feet from each other. It's a totally different acidity and pH, and they ripen at different times. And that's one of the really exciting things about working in the wine industry is you can look at chemistry and you can look at geology and you can look at climate, and it kind of ties in a lot of different passions that you might find, because you might be really interested in chemistry and just really like being in the lab. But then once you start doing punch downs, which is essentially punching down the fermenting fruit, you might fall in love with the cellar. And then once you go out into the vineyard and you start pruning grapevines and you start seeing all the differences between the different clones, and a clone is just we're not going to get into that, but a grape varietal here is just a different type of a grapevine. So here we have the Pinot, the Chardonnay, the Sauvignon Blanc, and the Syrah. And those are all different types of grapes. And it's just exciting. I guess I am not really able to articulate how much passion I have for this, but there's little tools like this web soil survey, seeing a map, and then this is a very bad, blurry view, but seeing just all the different little intricacies. It's exciting to me. And I hope that maybe someday this will be exciting to you as well. I didn't quite show some of these other things going on, like the yeast that I was going to make, but I figured, you can look that up on your own time. And I guess that's all for now. And once again, thank you for having me. And I'm available as well at I guess I could give Rosalie my information, but if anyone had any questions about entering the wine industry, winejobs.com is an absolute gem of a resource, and you can find internships there, whether you wanted to be out in the vineyard or whether you want to be in the cellar or the lab. It's a great resource, and I'm more than happy to share more resources with anybody. And my email is balmkrueger@gmail.com. But once again, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. That was a really great presentation. And if you don't mind, we'd love to open it up to questions. So if any of our students or audience members have some questions, that would be great. Stefan says, are you in charge of deciding when to harvest? What is the thought process of deciding when to harvest the vineyards, and when do you harvest to get your desired wine?
Great question. Thank you, Stefan, and the Doomslayer. At Rocchioli, I worked there not as the winemaker, but as a harvest team member. So Tom Rocchioli, who's an absolute Hall of Fame legend winemaker, like an actual Hall of Fame legend winemaker, which is why I'm so grateful I get to work with him. He is the one who decides when to harvest. And his thought process for deciding when to harvest is based on almost 4 decades worth of experience. So he goes out into the vineyards and has a pretty good idea of what he's looking for. And he's typically looking to harvest grapes at around 22 and a half bricks, depending on the vineyard. And that translates to around 13% alcohol. A lot of times when I say bricks, that's just a measurement of the density of sugar in solution. And so if I said 23 bricks, that would mean that there would be 23 grams of sugar per 100 grams of solution. And a good way to convert grams of sugar into potential alcohol is to multiply whatever that number is by around 0.55. So you could say 23 times 0.55 will be what you're likely to get for ethanol. So his thought process is he wants to go for a lower alcohol wine with higher acidity. And man, if you were around last year, you'd see that the thought process that goes into harvest is really contingent upon fires and smoke and worker availability. And that's another one of the fun things about working in the wine industry is Mother Nature has a huge say. Like I can guarantee you right now, people out in the vineyards yesterday and the day before were making sure that if they needed to water, they were watering. And if they needed to water today, they were watering at 5 a.m, not right now when you're going to be losing a lot of water to evaporation. So these are just things that everybody's always thinking about, as well as how can we save water? How can we save money? What's the labor situation like this year? Like that's what makes the wine industry really fun. Is it's not just science, it's not just economics, it's not just history or politics or any of these things. It's like a combination of a lot of them.
Speaking of watering, what impact do you think the drought and climate change will have on wine and cider? And what are wineries doing? Are they striving to conserve water, or what do you think about that topic?
Well, good question. The wine industry is a highly intensive water usage industry, but one of the things that most wineries are doing, I feel like, is most places have drip irrigation, and then a lot of drip irrigation is set to timers, and these timers are set to water during the part of the day when the least likelihood of getting evaporation takes place. So watering at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, 3 in the morning. So a lot of wineries are just also using high-end tools such as barrel washers that only use enough water and are shot out at high velocities so that they can save as much water as possible, because everyone's getting charged for this or being impacted in a certain way. I mean, I know my well ran dry last year, and I was actually cleaning a bunch of cider equipment and wine equipment here, and it was like, oh man, how can I make every drop of water last now? Because I'm taking showers and doing my dishes and flushing the toilet, and also want to clean the wine equipment, but I also don't want to pay $400 to get water delivered. And I'm just a small time person at my house, so I got to know that these big wineries are also feeling it.
Thank you. Another question from Stefan. What can happen to the fermentation process if you don't leave an air gap in the barrel?
Ooh, so great question, because actually I can see how I didn't clarify that slide. So that slide previously where the bung was open, that was because it was during active fermentation. And during active fermentation in those specific Chardonnay barrels, you're filling the barrel around 3/4 of the way full and leaving an air gap so that as CO2 is being released, and as say you had 23 bricks to start, that's going to go down to 22 and 20 and 17 and 15 and 12, and as it gets down to around 5 or 10, or even a little bit less, and as the fermentation becomes less vigorous, you're actually gonna fill in that air gap with other wine, like with other barrels, so that there's no air gap, so that there becomes no air gap at all as the fermentation completes. Because oxygen is your enemy in the winery. Like, oxygen is absolutely your enemy in the winery once the fermentation has finished. Until fermentation is finished, you need oxygen because the yeast need oxygen to live off of as they're doing the fermentation process. I hope that clarifies things a little bit.
Thank you. Are wineries experiencing any commercial competition with the cannabis industry?
I haven't really heard too much. I think there's some competition for labor potentially, but not as far as, I mean, for labor, which is a big one, but I think they're both pretty low paying industries comparatively. Definitely the wine industry. Once you start talking to your friends who all have advanced degrees and they're thinking about leaving to go get masters in business administration and other things, you realize you're doing it for the love of the passion.
Thank you.
But yeah, I guess also to answer a question that you had about like what impact does climate have right now in the wine industry, a lot of what's happening with global climate change is, an example would be overseas in the Champagne region of France. A lot of large growers are getting concerned about the climate warming up and their fruit not being at the levels it needs to be at to make high-end champagne. And so they're actually buying property in England where it's actually a lot colder, because they think that may warm up here in the future. And so I think that's happening right now in Sonoma County, even, is you're going to see more and more wineries buying vineyards out by the coast and in cooler and cooler and cooler climates, so that they're prepared to take advantage of climate change.
Thank you. With such, or Stefan asks, with such a shifting schedule throughout the year, what would you say are the most difficult months of winemaking? And what are the most fun months? And Stefan, feel free to keep asking questions.
Yeah. So definitely, oh man, the most difficult months of winemaking have got to be harvest. Like, because during harvest, you're battling climate, you're battling, as we've now experienced every single year since 2015, minus 2016, I think was our one non-fire year now. You're battling smoke taint or actual fire evacuation zones. Last year I went through a fire evacuation zone for 3 weeks straight or 2 weeks straight, and I had to go through CHP checkpoints and show my agricultural permits so that I could get to the winery. And that was, so the most difficult months are definitely harvest, because that's the critical time when it either happens or it doesn't happen. But those are also the most fun months. So I think most people will agree that the most difficult and the most fun months are the same time, which is probably August, September, October. But then the most stressful time for any winemaker, which they'll almost all agree upon as well, is bottling, because it's the final time that you can come up with your blend, which is also the other most important thing. Besides when you pick, it's how do you make your blends and choose what you're bottling. That's the second most important thing, in my opinion, for being a winemaker. And stressful, because once you put something in bottle, you can't take it out of the bottle and change anything. That's what it is. So
thank you. What impact has COVID had on the industry as far as consumption levels of alcohol and also the health and safety of workers, or supply of workers as well?
So the impact that it's actually had, I took a wine sales class this last semester, and the impact that COVID has had is that tasting rooms were shut down, wineries have been shut down, people are staying at home, and it's really, there's been a huge benefit to wineries that had a really good direct to consumer program, as well as a really good marketing program that had an online presence. So any wineries that could immediately start shipping out their wine to the end customer really benefited. Any wineries that were not technologically at the forefront were definitely a couple steps behind. COVID's had an impact this year as well on a lot of the high-end wineries here in Sonoma County. Rely on foreign interns to come out for harvest. And this was a big deal last year too. But it's really hard to find housing this year and last year, and but like especially these last couple of years. It's really hard for wineries that are paying really low wages to attract people from Spain and Argentina and Italy to come out here, because there's not a lot of housing. So there's actually a lot more people this year and last year that worked in, say, the restaurant industry or other industries that are now working at wineries as a temporary 3 to 5, 6 month job. So if that's something that interests you, I know that every winery out there is looking for harvest help this year.
That's good to know. One of my colleagues at the Sebastopol Library, Kathleen, has a question: corks or screw tops?
It really depends. Me personally, I'm a traditionalist, and I appreciate a nice cork in my wine. But one of the benefits to having a screw top is that you are not going to get TCA or cork taint, which is trichloral anisole. You might have heard of cork taint, like wet dog, wet cardboard, horse blanket, just like not good quality or characteristics. And that can happen if you have a tainted cork. And so you're not going to ever have that with the screw top.
If people are interested in finding your wine or buying your wine, can they do that?
How can people buy my wine? That's a great question. So currently, they would have to talk to me because we have not set up our marketing program yet. Ideally, in the future, we'll have a website up and do direct to consumer. But actually, the wine that I made a couple years ago or 2 years ago, and I bottled this year, that wine I can't legally sell because it wasn't made at a bonded facility. And once you get into the wine world, you realize there's so many regulations and legalities that come with dealing with an alcoholic product. And you go through the TTB, the ATF, the state, the federal government is just on and on with regulations. So I'm doing a lot of bartering for my wine, as well as selling it to my friends and family. For now. And then in the next couple of years, it will be to public and restaurants and all of that fun stuff. Once all the regulations have been fully passed.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today. This has been such a great presentation. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did too. And I just want to thank you for your time. And we'll see you at the library.
Definitely. Thank you as well.